as she said, I also did a translation. However, my translation is a little different in that I didn't do a literary text. It was actually historical text. I'm going to kind of use the sections of my poster for us to follow along with the presentation. So for this project, I was tasked with translating a text that was written in 1305 by a Catalan physician, and I do not speak Latin, so I won't butcher it for you, but it's very long. It's Regimen Sanitatis ad regem Aragonum. And so, as I said, I don't speak Latin, and so instead of using that text as my original source, I went to a translation that was produced in Spanish in 1606 by a jurist named Jerónimo de Mondragón. And the title that he chose for his work was El Maravilloso Regimiento y Orden de Vivir, which is very literal. The text belongs to a now extinct genre called Regimina Sanitatis, which is very popular in the Middle Ages. And so that title, based on what the genre was purposed for, is very literal, and I'll go more into detail later about the purpose of that genre. So as I said, both of the texts were produced in the Middle Ages. Even though they were produced 300 years apart, they both fall into that guideline of the medieval period or Middle Ages. That was kind of the greatest translation problem that I faced, because they talked about medical knowledge that is no longer practiced in current day and that no longer exists, and that kind of fell out of fashion soon after the translation was produced. And so my kind of purpose in translating, or scopos, which Corbin briefly discussed earlier, was to produce an accurate representation of that now extinct genre, but to make it a little bit friendlier for modern day readers. Because it was written in the Middle Ages, a lot of times you would see paragraph-long sentences, which was further complicated by the fact that Spanish, allows passive forms that English doesn't. And so if I had done a literal translation, it would have been very laborious for a modern-day reader to read. And so I kind of adapted the syntax while still remaining very literal and very faithful, so that would be easier for people to understand. But still keeping in mind that people had to come in with a specialized background in history of medicine in order to understand the text, because I do not adapt the concepts. So, in order to go a little deeper into Scopos theory so you'll understand what's coming next, Scopos theory is the belief that a text is active and communicative, and because it's trying to communicate with the reader, you have to take into account the culture and the background and the knowledge that the reader is bringing into the text in their reading of the text. And since I was dealing with a source text that's actually a translation of another text, I had to consider the background that went into the creation of both the Latin text and the Spanish text. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of that background that my readers would have to know now. So the medical theory that the text was based on was humoral medicine, which was basically a belief that there were 4 humors in the body that needed to stay in balance in order for one to be healthy, and that if there was any sort of imbalance in these humors, it would lead to disease. And the way to correct that was to alter the balance of humors. The 4 humors are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and it was believed that these humors not only comprised the human body, but basically anything that you could think of. As you'll see from the chart below, it was believed that air, food and drink, the amount or type of exercise that one would get, where they would rest, how they would rest, what position they would rest in, all of that could contribute to the balance of humors in the body. And so the Regimini Sanitatis genre that this text belonged to was actually structured around these 6 factors that could affect the balance of humors, and they were called the 6 non-naturals. And they were named after a physician who greatly influenced this medical tradition named Galen. And so the text that I was working with was actually divided into chapters, and each chapter was titled with one of these 6 non-naturals. So here's my schema of kind of translations of multilingual, multicultural process. So in creating my translation, I had to consider both the Latin source text and the Spanish source text. And the production of an English target text was the result. But while I was in the process of translating, I also had to consider the purpose of the English target text. That's why you see the double arrows, how the target text is both a production of the translation process, but it also influences the translation process. Although I did want my readers to already come in with a specialized knowledge, I still wanted to be sensitive to the fact that they weren't born in the Middle Ages, and so I made sure that I made the text a little more accessible for them. And so a couple of the factors from the Latin source text that influenced the translation The very author himself was a very interesting figure. He was a physician in a court, and so the text was actually commissioned by a king, and it was specifically directed to a king, so that influenced the way that the Spanish was presented. He never addressed the king by name, but it was very obvious that he was talking to one person. And the reason for that is because according to neuromedicine, each person has their own individual balance of humor, so it's not really possible to write a directive text about how one should order one's life in order to stay healthy by addressing multiple people, because each individual is unique. And again, that plays into the fact that the text is part of the Regiminis Sanitatis genre, and that genre was, it was a very personalized, individualized rule book for how one should conduct life in order to stay healthy. And that was a very well-known genre in the Middle Ages, and so since I'm assuming that my reader is coming in with a history of that knowledge, they would have expected my text to follow the kind of same style that that genre would have in the Middle Ages. Then from the point of view of the Spanish source text, which is the text that I was actually using in order to produce my translation, the man who created the translation was a jurist, which means he studied law and legal theory, and he perhaps might have served as a judge, although not much is known about him because the Spanish source text was actually just discovered in 1980, so not a lot of research has been done on it. But I thought it was interesting that he was involved in law because the original author of the text was actually brought up before the Inquisition, or at least his works were brought up before the Inquisition after his death, and they were accused of being heretical. So I think it would have been interesting to see how that kind of history of potentially heretical texts and him being a jurist and being involved in the legal profession would have influenced his translation process. Another interesting difference was that the Spanish source text explicitly stated that it was creating the work for a general public. And since the whole purpose of the genre was to address an individual and tell that individual how to conduct their life, I thought it was kind of a conflict that the translator stated that he wanted to make the work available for the general public, since clearly the general public doesn't all have the same balance of humors that would keep them healthy. Another interesting kind of socio-cultural or socio-political implication was that at this time vernacularization, or producing a text in a vernacular, which basically means a language other than Latin, was very controversial. We have to remember that in the Middle Ages, literacy was still very much an elite privilege. I think we're used to now pretty much everyone being literate and that being kind of the default, but in this time, most people probably wouldn't have been able to read. And if they had been able to read, they probably would have been able to afford these kinds of books because the books were still very expensive at the time that the text was produced. And so again, it kind of pulls into question his delineation of the general public as his audience, since he was probably really only talking to the elite when he was making this work. So that is pretty much all I have for you about my translation process and how it kind of unfolded. I don't know if you have any questions.
I'd be interested to hear how you chose that text.
I took a lot of history of medicine courses as an undergrad, and then my senior year I did an independent study on how the kind of influence of Jewish, Muslim, and Christian cultures influenced medical study and practice in the 14th through the 17th centuries. So I was already kind of interested in this particular historical moment.
So that meant you didn't have to do a lot of background work, which you would normally have to do on a text like this.
Yes, it was. I definitely knew what I was looking for,
Yeah.
so I was able to kind of focus in on the aspects that I wanted to bring to the forefront, because I've been studying history of medicine for a while.
Okay, that's very interesting. Anybody else? Very different from what we were looking at. Thank you. Oh, sorry, one more.
Who do you see this as your target audience?
Definitely those who are studying the history of medicine. For most history of medicine programs, you kind of have to come in with a knowledge of another language, and you're very much going to be doing historical analysis of texts, like the original text. So that's, I guess, who my audience would be for history of medicine scholars who don't necessarily speak Latin or Spanish.
Just one suggestion. Be careful with using terms like a general public.
Oh, that was the author's, the translator's term.
Yeah, but be careful because even though they call it general public, in that time, the people in that group was not everybody,
Right.
especially because nobody knew how to read. And women were not allowed to have knowledge. In the medical field, less than that. So it's not that bad, but I try to be more, try to define what you call general public, for you to just keep working with that in that context.
Duly noted. Thank you. Anyone else? All right, thank you for your time.
Thank you.